So here's the project for the COVID-19 Below the Wind remix. The song is at 90 BPM. Up here are the tracks from the OP1, the raw tracks. Here are the cut-up voices. I'll get to these after playing through the track. And here's the main track with all the instruments. So let's have a listen first. So that's a track. You can observe that every instrument and loop and everything that I use within this project is using stock logic only, and that's how I do it for all my remixes. So let's go. Now the first thing I did was to import in the tracks from the OP1. So they're much longer tracks actually because they're the entire length of the tape. I just cut them down to the sections I need, which is the 4-bar section of what I have. So this is the drum, this is the synth, the high synth, this is the pad, and this is the low synth. So now if you put them all together, just lay it on top of each other. They sound very much the same as what you'd hear on the OP1 tape when you press play. It's kind of there, it's got most of the elements, just not particularly polished yet, and that's exactly what we're going to do right now. The track up here is also the tape that it's the voice section of the tape that I chopped up so that I can create an EXS instrument from it. So with Logic 10.5, it's much easier. You can do the chopping up within Sampler, but I created this project before 10.5, so I did the old method, which was to go to Functions and remove silence. Where might that be? It's Edit or Functions. Yeah, remove silence from audio regions. And basically, for any track, if you do that, it's Command E. It will sort of try to help you. You can tweak around to get the sort of silence bits. I still had to manually modify it to get the sound. So here's what we have. COVID-19. So essentially, just the samples chopped up. And once I had the samples chopped up, I went to convert to new sampler track, and basically it created this one, which is an EXS track that you can play with like a MIDI track, right? So that's how I turned it into an instrument that I can play on my keyboard in front of Logic and change up the song a little bit from there. So as you can see, all the tracks that I have are here, the OP1 tracks. Put them in little tracks. So drums are here. That's a drums filtered one for the bridge section. This is the high ARP, which is track 2, the pad, and the low ARP. So let's see how I treated this first, and then we can go from there. Now, for the drums, I basically did 0, nothing, just levels. So it's just sounding exactly as it did when as the same as the OP1. Pretty straightforward. And for the high ARP, I just EQ'd it very slightly. Just made it a little bit brighter, took out the mids a little bit, and here's how it sounds. Without. Just a little bit brighter, and for these kind of ARPs, this high ARPs, I generally don't spread them very much, so it's just basically in the center. Now for the pad needs to be spread, so it was pretty small if you remember. It's a pretty nice pad, except that it's pretty small. So what I have here sounds like this. Much wider. The first thing I did, which is one of my favorites, is to use modulation chorus stereo within Logic. And one of my favorites also is to use mega wide chorus. There's not many preset options. Mega wide, and then tweak from there. Maybe the mix a little bit more, or the intensity. And you get this super wide chorus. See, let's take it out and have a listen, right? Take it out. With. So that adds this stereo-ness to it, but also the other thing you're hearing is a bus. So I'm setting this to bus 1, which is a space designer. And this is a large space Hall's vintage gear Hall at 100% wet, 0% dry. That's best to use 100% wet when you're sending to a bus. Easier to control levels. And a channel EQ on top of that, because I didn't want the reverb to capture too much low end. I just wanted it to have that shiny high end a little bit. So I bumped up the highs, removed the mid lows and the lows. Yeah, so here's what you get. And also EQ'd the actual track itself, remove all the low end, because this pad is very airy, so I didn't need any of that low stuff. And I've got a gain plugin here because I have actually automated the track, the volume automation. And to sort of rebalance it, I don't like going into automation to tweak it. I just put a gain, slap a gain there where you can find utility gain. And you can sort of mess with the levels after the automation, which is easier, I think. So this is just a volume automation, bringing it in at the start. The pad slowly comes in. So it gets bigger and bigger. So the intro is sort of this fade in, which I think is interesting because most songs fade out. But I decided to make this one fade in. And then, let's close the automation for a second. The low ARP is the fun one. It's got automation as well, volume automation. And just basically automates. I took out some really low end, so it's not super meant to serve as like some subby bass or something like that. And of course, again, to sort of gain it after the automation. In this case, you can see that it's minus 1.5, so I lowered it post automation, and there's a little curve going on here, a rough curve, but still a curve. So it's sort of how it comes in. So that's the bass. Now, something that I did was I paired the bass with another bass playing the same thing. And that's an ES2, one of my favorite sort of retro sounding amps in Logic. Great for this kind of synth wave type sounds. So I picked a synth bass, classic synth bass, tweaked it a little bit, probably added more sort of like resonance, sorry. I was thinking resolution. Resonance into it, and normally I just tweak it to get the kind of sound I want. So these are the settings. So I work from a preset and then I tweak it to a particular setting. Now it's playing the same notes as the bass line, but you can tell that this one's much lower. It's got much more sort of low end to it versus this one. So when you pair them, they kind of become one singular bass line that's really rich. And notice that this one has a gain as well because there's automation, but it's just not just it's not volume automation. It's actually the cutoff automation. So what I have is automating the cutoff. You can see in the ES2 track. Hang on. Look at the cutoff here, right? As we go through, you can see that the cutoff is automating, right? And that's why it's kind of like filter opening up. And here's how it sounds. So that's why the resonance is kind of adds a bit more character as well. When you sort of automate cutoffs, it's nice to have a little bit of resonance, I find. And that pairs together with the bass right there. So these two actually form one singular sound. And I think it's much nicer, much wider, much deeper as well. Adds a bit more character to it. And then underneath that, there is a pad. And it's a pad that's sort of like this, just filling the gaps. It's an alchemy pad. It's a wide saw pad, under pads, analog. So most of the nice old school sounds are in analog. And I added a chorus as well. In this case, it's a glimmering chorus, just to give it a bit more width and movement. So it's pretty straightforward, sort of like little bits of notes coming in. Right, to sort of build up the entire thing as we sort of automate everything in, and then the drums come in on sort of bar 8 of this. So it builds up, right? It's sort of a fade in, right, as you can see, and which I find is an interesting approach to something like that. And then we add more things. So we have this thing, and that melody sounds familiar because it's actually the little top melody. Sorry, not this one. I think it's this one. Yeah, that's right. So this is from the OP1. I'm just doubling it with another ES2. And you can see this one is the crunchy trance. And it gets the right sort of texture, that one. If I'm not mistaken, I messed around with the output ADSR, the amp envelope. Gets it a bit more plinky. And then I EQ'd the low end off, because this one's meant to sit right on top. So if you put them together, you can hear the separation between these two, but it's fine. You know, they're sitting on top of each other playing the same notes. And what I love is that it interacts with the bass line, which is this one, and this one, and this one. So you get that rich sound. Which I think is pretty cool. So it widens up the sound by just I just doubled up the synths to get, you know, more richness out of it. And you can see that the main tracks are still playing. And let's see, we have an extra hat here. It's a pretty straightforward one. It's EXS24, the Roland 808 kit, TR808. And instead of playing it, I use an ARP and programmed, I use an ARP and programmed the pattern in. So this pattern, I went to grid, and then I programmed this pattern in, an 8-bar pattern, and it's actually just a single note playing the whole pattern. So that's just a little hat to enhance the drum beat. So let's go back to the drums here and have a listen with them together. Adds a bit more groove into the whole rhythm, which I think is what's needed when we get into the verse, so to speak. So the verse, right, is the voices, pretty straightforward, sampled. COVID-19! Okay. Right? But you can hear this sort of aggression in the voice. And what I did, which I kind of liked, was first thing is I EQ'd it, so it becomes much boxier. Without the EQ and compressor, it's sounding like COVID-19. It's a bit buried. So with the EQ, COVID-19, a bit more radio-like, but I think it sits in the track really well. And a compressor, which is just the Studio Fat compressor tweaked. I find it's the most aggressive one. So it's COVID-19, just to bring up the level. I'm sending it to bus 1 as well, which is the one that I sent the instruments through. But bus 2 is exclusively for the voice, and it's not a reverb, it's a pedal board. And I use a fuzz machine to give it a little bit more aggression, and I took out the sort of mids because it was a little bit too harsh. So let's just hear it by itself. It's just this lots of hairiness to the voice, which I think adds a lot of aggression. So I'm actually sending this. So what happens is, instead of putting it in line as an insert, I'm sending it out to bus 2, Because if I put it as an insert, the whole sound would be affected, and that's all you hear, kind of like this sound.
COVID-19!
But what I wanted was a mix between the original sound and that sound. So I just wanted...
COVID-19!
this one is the mix. But if we muted the synth,
COVID-19!
it's not as aggressive. So with the synth,
COVID-19!
so it's got a little bit more harmonics in it, which I really like. So yeah, that's the main vocal track. There's the minion track as well, which I've panned slightly to the left. It's also very heavily EQ'd and compressed. Same kind of compression. And it's just this. So this one is just very sort of a lot highs, not much distortion. There's also one here. So they kind of double to give it a bit of slightly more, a slightly wider kind of sound, because this guy is clearer and on the left. And then the blow is also a bit different. The EQ is slightly different. The compression is the same, and there's a stereo delay, right? I just tweaked it, the default one to taste, and the blow has a stereo delay, so it just goes. Yeah, it just adds a bit more drama to it. And it's paired, you can see, with a falling star effect. So every time you have that blow sound. And you can find the falling star effects under loops. I love all these fall stuff, so you can find falls and falling star effects and stuff like that. Yeah, and you can just put them where you want a bit of drama, a bit of accents. You can see there's a noise riser as well. And you just search for risers under loops, you'll find lots of nice risers. Just to hit the points, you know, like... And you can see that to lead up with the noise, there's also a big sweeper, which is a retro synth. And you can find that on the synth pads, big sweeper. Basically, here's how it sounds. So it does exactly what the box says. It's a big sweeper. It sweeps a nice big path through. Helps give a little bit more tonality to the noise riser, I feel. And here's a little bit more enhancement. It's a retro synth as well, called the Berlin Experience under synth pads. It sounds a bit Blade Runner-y. It's pretty cool. It's just little sort of chords, cadences to add to the feeling of it. You can hear it just right above in the background, which I think kind of enhances it a little bit. And the second time the verse gets played, I add a loop, and it's one of those toppers. You can find toppers, and topper has lots of nice little tops of beats that you can put on top. And in this case, this one was a pretty straightforward. Yeah, I just felt that it enhanced the rhythm. So if you play it together with, say, some rhythmic elements, let's see. Just gives a little bit more character. So all these things don't have to be very in your face. They can be subtle, but just felt rather than, you know, every element of it can be heard. And then we sort of bring it down again. So you can see it's just a matter of bringing things in, bringing things out. It's very grid-like, this particular song, and that's the nature of these kind of tracks as well. You notice that there are guitar tracks. This was the guitar recording track, so that's why it's empty. So I like to record on this one track and then pull everything down to other tracks. It's just easier to do that way. And here's how it sounds. So it's just a basic sort of like almost like an ARP guitar, right? I use an amp, which is the Blues Blaster under distorted. There's a stereo delay, you can definitely hear that, and there's a channel EQ to get rid of a lot of stuff just to keep it boxy. What I love about guitars is you can EQ them quite harshly. You can push things up and down because of the harmonics, and it still sounds pretty okay. So it's more about where you want it to sit. So this wasn't meant to really jump out, so that's why a lot of it's EQ'd out, and it's also being sent to bus 1. Now also, just to get because everything is super locked and quantized, very synth-like. The guitars are also very here we go, very sort of quantized. So you can open your flex, turn on flex, and I pick polyphonic. Polyphonic is good for the guitar stuff, and I quantize it to 1/16, so you can see all the quantizing happening here. And I feel that it sits better that way. In most cases, I wouldn't quantize guitar, but in this case, I do because it's just sitting on top stuff that's really, really locked to the clock. And yeah, that's how I think it sounds better. So it's not really super apparent, but it is there and you can hear it. And the part when it drops, I sort of drop the guitars as well. So I pull the guitars down and it's not so panned, it's more centered, and then it goes back up when in the second section. And you can see like little falls here as well, which I really like. Really nice sci-fi sort of sounds. You can always design your own sound design as well. You can always just create a bunch of rises and falls and stuff like that, and then plonk them into your projects. Have fun with your synths if you have any hardware synths, especially. It's fun to create rises and falls, different kinds, and to see what you can come up with. These are the sound design elements, so I think that could be quite fun. Yeah, and the vocals just kind of go on with the different tracks. The blows are all here, as we know. And then things just come in. So you can see that, they just build up with layers on top of each other without being too over the top. And then it kind of drops. So a song needs to have dynamics. My sort of take on this is always it needs to sort of like rise up. Or you could start big and kind of go down and up and then really down and really up or something. You need to have those differences in up and down. It's not just like up, down. So it's like up a 2, down a 3, and then up 6, down 2. So you can have a little bit more dynamics in the song, which I think it's necessary to make it just fun to listen to and more interesting. Now we have this sort of like bridge breakdown section, and so I filtered the drums, and it's a really simple filter. I think it's automated as well. Yeah, you can see that the high shelf frequency, which is you can find under channel EQ, high shelf frequency, is automated, and it just moves around a little bit. So it starts off really sort of filtered. The low end is completely just, oh no, sorry, that's the voice. Yeah, that's right. So you can see that it opens up as we go. So the voice opens up as well. Yeah. So you can open up your filters through automation. I like to do it that way. It kind of works for me. And then you have your drums, and let's see if the drums. No, the drum is filtered all the way, and it's a pretty straight up filter. Just the high shelf, and everything is just pulled down, so it sounds like. That's all you need, really. And I didn't feel I needed any reverb or anything like that because not everything needs to be. I like the punchiness of this. Synth bass. Let's see what happens. There's a lot of movement going on here. You can see that there's movement in the verses as well. There's ups and downs. And this one, I think, is the most sort of dynamic frequency-wise of everything. So it goes into nothingness, and then it goes up. Yeah, to a pretty high point. And you can also see that this one is kind of rising right before the whole. So it works together, and I like things that kind of work together as opposed to just independently doing their own thing. I love the idea of sort of instruments like a band, and the band's always looking out at each member, and they're all sort of interacting and keeping eye contact and nodding their heads and smiling a little bit, so that they're kind of playing together as opposed to just saying that, oh, my bass part is just doing its own thing. So sometimes I feel like it's good to have elements work together. And the bottom of this, there's an alchemy pad, pretty straightforward, chameleon pad, and the pad's analog, and a chorus on it as well, pad enhancer, right? And it's just a big ass, simple pad. And you can see there's automation on it as well. And this is the cutoff, so it gets bigger. And that's kind of it, right? So, you can see all these rises and stuff helping as well. So you can see that the automation is working together. And like stuff like the falling star effect, I always feel like they're equivalent. So, like instruments have textures, have attack decays, and sort of frequency ranges. I always find that you can substitute things for that have the same characteristics. So if you think about it, say a crash cymbal, right? It's a really big attack, fairly noisy, and it decays over time. And if you think about it, the falling star effect, it's basically the same sort of structure I just described. It's got a big attack. It's quite noise. The most of the frequencies are covered, so it's quite noise type frequency, and it decays at a sort of a slowish rate. So technically, all these are useful as sort of crash cymbal substitutes as well. And you could use a real crash too, or you could use a electronic crash or something. And that's where it gets interesting. You can sort of say, I need something here that serves like a crash or like a bass or like a fill. What do I do that serves that purpose as opposed to looking at the form? So let's look at the function and say, okay, what does it need to do? So then it opens up your palette of what you can use. So this part is pretty much the same as the opening bits, except for this extra snare here. So there's the snare, pretty straightforward snare, and you can find it under single drums, snares, electronic snares, and let's pick one that's suited, and I send it to bus 1 as well. So in this case, the snare needed to be slightly bigger. And I like to make these sounds as if they're from the same sort of player, same kit. So it feels a little bit more like that as opposed to just a very, very separate snare. Feels a little bit more integrated with the reverb. And then right at the end, there's also a topper, a tambourine topper. So with the snare and tambourine, so it gets sort of groovier in stages. And then there's also an extra synth. This one is like super high resonance. You can see that the resonance is really high here. And it's also got an auto filter on, right? And the resonance got high as well. So you get all these nice juicy sounds. So it's quite nice to hear that interaction, and it kind of sort of like helps bring everything. So this is the biggest section, right? Oh yeah, there's also this guitar in the bridge. It's pretty. It's almost like you can't hear it, which I wanted it to be like almost like played in the next cave from you kind of sound. And basically I EQ'd the heck out of the top end of the guitar, mostly the low end, so it's just left with this little slice here, right? And the stereo delay remains, space designer remains, and it's really soft. Oh, the space designer is a new one, sorry. It's an insert, which means that you put it in line with all the other effects, right, as opposed to sending it on the bus. It's 100% wet, very little dry, so you can almost hear just the reverbs rather than the original sound, and you can see it's mixed really low. It's a super long reverb as well. It's a large space halls, conservatory 11.7 second reverb. So it's kind of this melody that's ghostly just sitting in the background. And that melody gets revisited right at the end. In its proper sort of incarnation. So So this is kind of like the first introduction of that melody, which you can almost hardly hear unless you're sort of really paying attention or using great headphones. And then it really comes back in full tilt right at the end. And I like sort of how it's sort of hinted at only, and then it really comes back in. And even then, it's not the overriding sound. And you can see this one's panned to the right a little bit. So stuff that I don't want to pay like super, focus attention to, I tend to pan a little bit to the left or to the right. Not too much, just a little bit. And I obviously tend to mix them lower in terms of volume as well. And you can see that this one has none of that inline reverb thing. This one is just pretty much straight up stereo delay and just the amp. And the EQ is just, taking out all the low end and just bumping up the highs a little bit. So I hope you learned something from this arrangement, like taking an idea from one of your synthesizers, just some basic tracks like this, and turning it into something like this. Yeah, it's just a matter of, understanding what you need, not putting too much, and just having things sit in the right place. So I hope that's enjoyable for you. Happy creating.